Alright, we are back with a new video, and we got a bit of an interesting one today, where I'll be breaking down my top 5 overrated Survivor winners. Now this is sort of an idea I had for a bit of a while, as I did consider doing a full-blown Survivor winner ranking. However, I kind of decided that other YouTube channels, namely the Marine Review and Flipmasters, have already done those videos and explained them pretty well, and I feel like my list would have been largely similar to theirs. So I'll link to their videos in the description. And for my channel at least, I figured this would be a more interesting approach to go about it. Now, I will say up front that just because a player is overrated doesn't mean that I think that they're bad or that they played a bad game on their winning season. This is more so how I sense their perception within the fandom to be when compared to the actual game that they played, and how I feel about them as winners in general. But before we get into this list, I do have some honorable mentions to go through, so I'll run through those quickly. First up, we have Brian Heideck, the winner of Survivor Thailand. And Brian's interesting because he's obviously one of the more dominant winners in Survivor history. He really controlled that season from beginning to end. And there are a lot of flaws with his game. I mean, for one, he only wins in a 4-3 vote against Clay. And also, there are plenty of issues with how he handled a lot of the people in the Sukjai tribe, the minority tribe that was largely pagonged in the post-merge, where he didn't even know some of their names, which was pretty funny, but obviously greatly contributed to him being a bit highly assessed at the time. However, the main reason he's not on this list is I feel like people have largely caught up to his flaws with this game and recognize that his game's probably not repeatable in the modern day, to where I don't really feel like he's overrated anymore, but he was still a consideration for this list. Next up, we have Yul Kwan, the winner of Survivor Cook Islands. And I feel like he's on a largely similar boat to Brian in the sense that, yes, he did play a very strong game and there are some issues to it, but I feel like people recognize some of those issues with his game, like the fact that he had the God Idol that he could play at the Final Four in his season with the surprise Final Three, which basically gave him a free ride to Final Tribal. Also, the bottle twist, which really benefited the I-2-4 and really made it so that it was possible for them to flip Penner at the merge and really take control of the game from that point forward. So he definitely got benefited by a lot of twists, and like those are definitely issues to talk about when talking about his game. However, I feel like people have really caught up to those things to where they don't really overrate him too much. And plus, he did come from an earlier era of the show, where like an era that people probably don't remember super well. And I feel like even from his season, people are more likely to remember people like Ozzy, Parvati, even Penner to a degree compared to Yul. So he kind of gets forgotten about as well. So I feel like he's not really the most overrated either. Next up, we have JT Thomas, the winner of Survivor Tokensheens. And he was obviously pretty well remembered as being one of the greatest winners at the time of his win, to where he was the first person to complete a perfect game. And it seemed like everyone on the season simply loved him. And obviously, there was even a debate for him being one of the greatest players of all time. But similar to these other winners, I feel like people have largely lowered their perception of him over time, particularly through his later appearances on Heroes vs. Villains and later on Game Changers, neither of which went super well for him. Although I feel like even then he gets a bit too much hate for Heroes vs. Villains, where he really was able to scrape his way through a bad position. And had he gained the numbers at the merge, like he would have been in a pretty prime position moving forward. It's just through him making the bad read of thinking Russell was on the outs and giving him his idol, which was then used to then idle him out of the game, that led him to flame out there. And then obviously Game Changers was pretty bad as well, to where he had an idol and didn't play and got idled out as a result. So that wasn't particularly great. And again, I feel like through those subsequent appearances, people have largely come back down to earth on him, and I don't feel like too many people are considering him that great anymore, but he still played a pretty decent game. However, I wouldn't really consider him overrated at this point. Next up, we have Boston Rob, the winner of Survivor Redemption Island, and I can see the debate for him being overrated. People talk about how in All-Stars, he burned a lot of the jury members to ultimately cost him the game at the end. But even then, I feel like had Sheehan had a better understanding of the game, to where she thought Amber was the mastermind for whatever reason, had she had the more accurate read, he probably wins the game anyway. And even against Jenna, I feel like he has a decent shot of winning a jury vote there. But I think he gets a lot more flack from people with his Redemption Island game, how people talk about how Ometepe was filled with idiots and people that were just willing to let Boston Rob run the game. And while that is technically true, I mean, I still feel like the fact he was able to really dominate the game in an impressive way. And the fact that he was able to do it twice, I mean, on All Stars and then later again in Redemption Island, shows how his game can be done in multiple seasons, even though I feel like it's less likely to work on a modern cast, as we saw him attempt to do the buddy method on Winners at War and fail to do so there. But I also feel like he gets a bit underrated with his heroes versus villains game. I mean, people tend to forget that he actually played pretty well on heroes versus villains, and had Tyson not screwed up the vote that caused him to idle himself out of the game, I feel like Boston Rob would have been in a pretty prime position to control the villain's tribe moving forward as opposed to Russell. So I feel like even then, I feel like he did a decent job. And even after Tyson got voted out, he still technically had the numbers on the villain's tribe. It was more so through Jerry flipping that resulted in him being the next one out. So I feel like he gets a bit underrated for his heroes versus villains game. In his Marquesas game, I mean, yes, he did play a bit too aggressively and was a bit of a bull in a channel shop, but he was sort of ahead of his time with the way that I talked about the game. He obviously controlled the Hunter vote, voted the leader figure out so early, and especially in an era of the show where someone like Hunter probably would have made it a bit further, the fact that he was able to get him out was a bit of an indication of what Boston Rob might become in the future. So I feel like, yes, there is a debate for Boston Rob to be overrated if we look at solely at his Redemption Island game. But I feel like there's enough merit there between his Heroes vs. Villains game and the fact that he was able to repeat what he did on All Stars to where I don't really consider him the most overrated winner per se. Next up, we have Ken Spradlin, who is kind of in a similar boat to Boston Rob in the sense that she controlled One World, and there's a debate there for, you know, like the cast of One World not really being the best in the world. But I feel like she came back on Winners at War and really showed that she was able to play from the bottom. And I feel like Winners at War showed that she was a great player to where I can't really consider her the most overrated there. Next up, we have John Cochran, the winner of Survivor Karamoan. And I feel like he was a bit closer to making the list in terms of him being overrated. But similar to other winners that we talked about in this honorable mention section, I feel like people largely acknowledged the flaws with Cochran's game. I mean, they acknowledged the fact that, you know, like he came into Karamoan with a bunch of people that he knew from outside the game. He obviously had Dawn, who was one of his closest allies from South Pacific, and he was set up pretty well to dominate that game. So I feel like because of that, people actually tend to discredit Cochran's Karamoan game to a large degree. And plus, when you look at his South Pacific game, I mean, people have largely picked up on the fact that he is a high variance player. So I feel like with that in mind, I can't really consider him overrated, even though his winning game was certainly better than what he is as a player on the whole. Next up, we have Tyson, and I feel like Tyson is more similar to Boston Rob in that he technically didn't do super well his first couple times. It took him 3 tries to win. But I feel like Tyson is a bit of an interesting figure in the sense that he probably wins token sheets if it gets to the end. It's just that he was such a big threat coming to the merge that he didn't really have much of a path to get to the end. He obviously makes the mistake on Heroes vs. Villains of voting for Parvati in a position that allowed Russell to idle him out of the game. And obviously people tend to give him a lot of crap for that. And then obviously there's his Blood versus Water game, but even then, like, he played pretty solid, but people tend to acknowledge the fact that he didn't play his idol at the final 6, which resulted in him having to draw rocks. So I feel like Tyson is an interesting case in the sense that people recognize that his flaws. He is technically behind one of the quote-unquote dumbest moves in Survivor history by voting himself out of the game, and people tend to give him a lot of crap for the not playing the idol in Blood versus Water. So I feel like because of that, I can't really consider him the most overrated, although he still has plenty of flaws with his career. Next up, we have Tony Velachos, the other 2-time winner in Survivor history. And I feel like he's kind of on a similar boat to the other winners we've been talking about here, where people, again, at the time acknowledged the shortcomings with this game. I mean, even at the time of Kage-yan, people were saying how this wasn't really a repeatable win, and they obviously were vindicated in Game Changers when it seemed like he was sort of this one-hit wonder. And then coming into Winners of War, while he plays an extremely impressive game there to become the second 2-time winner, I feel like people tend to discredit him a bit because, yes, while he is a 2-time winner, people point out the fact that Well, obviously he was going to be a two-time winner because Winners at War was all winners. There was always going to be a two-time winner coming out of that season unless Sandra somehow won again. While they tend to prop up Sandra for becoming a two-time winner in a season where that was not a guaranteed prospect. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Tony can actually be a bit underrated as people tend to point out a lot of his flaws, both at the time of his first win and even now after his second win. So I don't really feel like Tony is overrated. I actually think he's slightly underrated, but that's not really the subject of this video. In the final honorable mention that I'll include here is Wendell Holland, the winner of Survivor Ghost Island. And I feel like similar to Tony, Wendell is actually kind of underrated, as at the time of Ghost Island, it seemed like the debate was that Dominic played the better game than Wendell. And that, yes, while Wendell wasn't undeserving per se, they feel like Dominic got way more credit on the show for controlling the game, and through that he probably should have won the jury vote over Wendell. And coming into Winners of War, he obviously didn't have as strong of a run there. He was taken out at the merge. And through that, people don't really assess Wendell too highly. Even so, he has been known to get a bit cocky at points during some of his runs, particularly in Ghost Island. There were some moments where he came off a bit arrogant there. So that's the main reason I included him as an honorable mention. But again, I don't really consider him the most overrated winner per se. And that'll do it for these honorable mentions. And with that, we will now move on to the actual list. And again, this is a top 5 list. And as I alluded to at the beginning of the video, just because a winner is overrated doesn't mean that I think that they played a bad game. In fact, actually, I feel like a lot of these people are actually pretty good winners in the grand scheme of things. However, I feel like with the way that they're talked about in the Survivor community, they tend to get a bit overrated, so I will be factoring that in. So without further ado, let's get right into the list. So starting off at number 5, we have a bit of an interesting case in that for the longest time, this person wasn't really overrated. They were more so forgotten about. But I feel like with the attention this person has gotten in recent years, I feel like it has now gone to the point where they are a bit overrated. But here we have Vecepia Towery, the winner of Survivor Marquesas. And again, I feel like for the longest time, Vecepia was largely forgotten about in Survivor history, as she was seen by a lot of people as one of the most boring winners. And when surrounded by more iconic winners like Rich, Tina, Ethan, even people like Sandra later on in this golden age of Survivor, like Vecepia did get forgotten about for a lot of it. And even compared to people on her own season, she obviously gets overshadowed by Boston Rob and even Kathy, like people that like returned for later seasons while Vecepia never returned. But I feel like over the last few years, she's been getting a lot more attention. She obviously was pretty vocal during the push for more diversity in casting during 2020. And through that, people started to reassess her game. And through that, people started to see her as this underrated winner and start propping her up as this pretty strong player. And to be fair, I think there are some merits to her game. I think the way that she handles the final 4 round is pretty strong, where she wins immunity and then makes a deal with Kathy to ensure that she gets through that. And then in final 3, as soon as Kathy drops out of final immunity, she turns around, makes a deal with Nalia, guaranteeing her spot in the final 2. And through that is able to cut Kathy at the end, which isn't handled super well. I mean, she obviously ends up burning Kathy to the point where Kathy doesn't really vote for her. And Vecepia also gets a lot of credit for building bonds with the Rotus after the swap, to where she wasn't really targeted by a lot of them. And she was largely seen as a non-threat for a lot of it, to where people like Boston Rob and Sean were getting targeted over her by the Rotu 4 after the merge. So I think there are some merits to her game, but at the end of the day, I feel like these merits have been largely blown up to where I feel like people are giving her a bit too much credit. I feel like people have kind of been giving her credit for the flip at the final 9 that flipped the game, where really I feel like she gets at best shared credit between her, Kathy, Nalia, and Pascal, to where more realistically you can make the debate that Vecepia was the least involved in the flip and that she was really one of the last people to be added to it. So I feel like through all that, plus what we saw in the last couple of years of people starting to really talk so much about how underrated she is, I feel like that it has in turn contributed to her being a bit overrated. Now, I don't think she's that overrated to where she's a flat out bad winner. However, I feel like people have been propping up some of her moves a bit too much while kind of forgetting about some of the more negative aspects to her game, like the fact that she didn't have as much control earlier on, the fact that she gets a bit too much credit for the flip at the final nine, and then even at the end game, which I would consider to be her best move, even then that's not without some negatives, particularly in how she handles Kathy when she cuts her at the final three. So through those, I figure Kat Visepia probably is a bit overrated and a big reason that she's here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4. And again, we are sticking with an older winner and definitely one of the most fondly remembered winners and certainly one of the more dominant winners, but one that I think people tend to forget a bit of their downsides. And here we have Tom Westman, the winner of Survivor Palau. And Tom is a pretty good winner. He did dominate a lot of that game. He was a leader figure for the Koror tribe, which did dominate a lot of those challenges. And in turn, he dominated himself physically, winning 5 individual immunity challenges across the season while tying the record for most individual wins across the season. So I find a lot of that pretty impressive. But I think there are 2 main elements that cause him to be a bit overrated. One is that I think people tend to forget about Ian and Greg's shared role in dominating the game. Maybe Greg less so, but certainly Ian was a key factor in Tom's ability to dominate the game. Ian was pretty well respected. He was sort of looked at as his second figure behind Tom, and he had some critical relationships, particularly with people like Katie, and to a degree with the Greg and Jen sides that allowed Tom to remain in control for a lot of the game. To where if he didn't have those relationships, then there's a chance that at that merge or absorption that Kobe and Janu are able to flip Stephanie and in turn be able to control the game for themselves. Mind you, I do have to give Tom a decent amount of credit for building the bond with Stephanie early on before the tribes were formed. I feel like he deserves some credit there. But again, people tend to talk about him as if he was the sole dominant figure in the game, whereas I feel like other people deserve some credit there. So I feel like that's something to go in Tom's favor. And then the other factor is the fact that he did technically have to win those last couple of challenges. He was seen as the biggest threat towards the end of the game. And had he not won Final 4 and Final 3 immunity, that he would have lost the game there. Now, granted, people do give him credit for being able to convince Ian to drop out Final immunity. And I do have to give him some credit there. But even then, the fact remained that Tom was already in a not great position there. He had to win that Final immunity. Whereas Ian, as long as him or Katie won, that there's a chance that he gets to the end as well and probably wins against Katie. Whereas Tom needed to win that final immunity. So I think those are factors that people tend to forget about. And a big reason that I consider Tom to be a bit overrated. Again, I think Tom is still a great winner, but I feel like he does get a bit overlooked in terms of his flaws, which leads him to be here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3. And I feel like this pick is going to be pretty controversial. And I know people will defend this person as one of the greatest players of all time. And to be fair, I do consider this person to be one of the greatest players to ever play. However, I feel like people tend to overlook this person's issues with their games when talking about them, which leads me to think that they're overrated. But here at number 3, we do have Parvati Shallow, the winner of Survivor Micronesia. And again, I do think Parvati is one of the greatest players ever. And there is a lot of merit that you can point to. I mean, she had one of the best track records in Survivor history. I mean, before Winners of War, where her worst finish before Winners of War was 6th place. And that was on Cook Islands, where, she wasn't playing as hard as she did in the later seasons. And even at Winners of War, I mean, yeah, she wasn't going to be doing particularly well given her target. But even with that target, she made it to the swap and she made it pretty decently far into the pre-merge. So I feel like there's still a lot of merit you can give Parvati. And she does play a pretty impressive winning game on Micronesia. Now, with that said, I feel like people tend to call her the greatest player of all time, when I do have some reservations with that. Now, if we're going through each of her games, I mean, we start out with Cook Islands, where she was in a pretty decent position for a lot of it. She was in the core majority for a lot of it. Now, mind you, you can question how much she was truly playing that season, but she did get all the way to the final 6. And while her group did lose the numbers, around the merge, and again, you can attribute some of that to some weird circumstances like the bottle twist and them losing all those challenges after the mutiny, she was still one of the last people from Raro to be targeted. And I feel like you can give her some credit for that. But even then, I mean, she was in a pretty bad spot after that point to where she probably wasn't going to get to the end. So there's that to consider. Micronesia is one that she gets a lot of attention for, but even then, there are still some issues with it. Like, for one, she probably would have been the first boot of that season had Johnny Fairpay not quit the game, where we saw like a lot of people on that favorites tribe, particularly Penner, really want to target her immediately. And it's through Fairplay wanting to quit the game that allowed her to get through that early round. But through that, she was able to dominate a lot of that game. Now, I think she gets a bit too much credit with each of the moves that the Black Widow Brigade were making. I mean, I know even some people were giving her credit for Eric giving up immunity at the final five, when really Parvati had probably the least involvement with that actual move, but that happened. And then ultimately, the biggest knock to her game, aside from almost being the first boot, is the fact that she wanted to go to the final three with Suri in a spot where she assumed it was going to be a final three. And had that happened, I mean, a lot of people have already forecast this jury vote. I mean, it's more than likely Parvati loses that jury vote if it had been a final three against Amanda and Suri. It's more so to the fortune of like it being a final two and Suri getting cut as a result that allows Parvati to win that season. And then we jump forward to Heroes versus Villains, in which I think that's probably her most overrated game, where, again, people have pointed out some of these issues before, but people give her so much credit for things like the double idol play and her surviving the Tyson round. But, I mean, if we're going through each of those moves, I mean, for one, I mean, the whole Tyson situation was a bit fluky, and I feel like Russell probably deserves more credit for that. And as for the double idol play, I mean, yeah, it is impressive that she was able to ensure that the villains got the numbers moving forward, but it's also something that sows distrust with Russell, to where by her playing that second idol and not telling him about that second idol, that causes him to start to see her as a threat. That allows him to start to make moves against her, such as the Danielle vote. And on top of that, she really isn't able to distance herself from Russell at all, to where by the end game, like, she is essentially in a spot where she's probably going to lose the game. Now, she probably wins in a final three against her, Russell, and Jerry. However, she definitely loses against Sandra. And even then, like, she was being targeted during the final six and final five rounds. So even that situation was a bit fluky. And as I alluded to earlier with Micronesia, she was technically targeted early on in Heroes versus Villains, wasn't in the great spot to start out that game either. So it's sort of a weird game to assess, and definitely one that gets a bit too much credit at the end of the day. So when we're looking at Parvati as a whole, I do think she is a great player, and she has a great track record across her career. But people talk about her as if she's this flawless player and how she was this robbed goddess on Heroes versus Villains, when in reality, there are plenty of issues to point out, not just with Heroes versus Villains, but even her winning game on Micronesia. So I think on the whole, she does get a bit overrated in my eyes. And while she is a great player, she is definitely one of the most overrated in my opinion. And because of that, she is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2. And I feel like this one will probably be a bit less controversial than the number 3 one, but still probably less controversial than the number 1 option I'm going to have here. But here at number 2, we have Richard Hatch, the original winner of Survivor. And I think, admittedly, some people will probably agree that he's overrated to where he might be a bit lower here. But there are still a ton of people that talk about him as being one of the greatest winners of all time, simply because he was the first person to do so. When in reality, I feel like there are plenty of holes with his game, and I think he gets a bit too much credit for certain things. For one, I think he gets way too much credit for creating the alliance as if that was some revolutionary idea. And admittedly, I mean, when you think about the game of Survivor, I mean, yeah, the idea of creating an alliance can be seen as revolutionary if you're seeing it as this primarily survival based show. However, once you introduce the idea of voting people out, I mean, inevitably people will be thinking strategically at some point. And given how basic the idea of an alliance is when it comes to making sure you have the numbers, I feel like it was probably only a matter of time before the idea of an alliance was going to be invented anyway, regardless of what Rich or anyone did. And even aside from that, Rich technically did not create the alliance. I mean, we even see on the Toggy tribe that Kelly and Stacy and Sue, they were the ones to create an alliance before Rich was even around. And then obviously Stacy was voted out pretty early. But even with the alliance that Rich ends up in, and the one that gets all this credit for running the game of Borneo, I mean, Rich didn't even create it, and he was actually the third person to be added to it. Kelly and Sue were the ones to create it and then added Rich in afterwards, and then Rudy as the fourth. So even then, Rich did not create the alliance. Now, granted, he is definitely the one of the more strategic thinkers within that alliance, and through that, you can give him some credit for that. But people talk about him as if he's the sole figure that was the only person thinking strategically, when in reality, there were plenty of people that were thinking strategically. And even on the Pagong tribe, there are definitely people that recognized the strategy that was taking place, but it was more so due to their morals or inability to like coordinate that prevented them from creating this counter alliance on its own. But even if we're ignoring that, I mean, there are definitely points where the game could have been flipped on Rich. I mean, there was obviously the merge vote, which is a 4-1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 vote, which highlighted the benefits of having an alliance. I mean, Rich definitely gets lucky that the Bagongs don't really see that vote as an opportunity to get along. He also gets lucky that Kelly doesn't actually flip to the Bagongs at any point, and she essentially becomes a lone wolf figure. He also gets lucky that Kelly flips on Sue at the final four when that vote was a tie, when he was the other option there. So he definitely gets lucky there. And I feel like in general, Rich gets a bit too cocky with his positioning up points. And had this been a later season where people were thinking more strategically, Rich definitely gets flipped on at some points. And through that, I can't really consider him to be that great of a player at the end of the day. So I think through that, people definitely overrate him to a great degree. And then obviously there's his All-Stars game, which definitely brings him down, largely due to his non-gameplay actions on that season. But even aside from that, I mean, he obviously doesn't really take the game seriously in that season. Mind you, that was because he recognized that he had no shot at winning. So because of that, it's really only his Borneo game that we can look at. But that Borneo game still has plenty of holes within it. And I feel like just him being credited as this creator of the alliance gets a bit overblown. And I feel like as a result of people like not recognizing the actions of other people from that season. So I think through that, Rich gets greatly overrated at the end of the day. And that's a big reason he's this high on the list. However, I feel like there's one other person that I think is a bit more overrated at the end of the day, which leads me to put him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the most overrated Survivor winner for me will be a controversial one, but I'm sure plenty of people will agree with me here. And here we have Sandra, the 2-time winner of the show. And obviously, I mentioned Tony in my honorable mentions as someone who became a 2-time winner by default, technically speaking. And here we have Sandra, the person that became a 2-time winner through seasons that were not by default per se. But even so, I feel like Sandra is pretty overrated if we're looking at both her Pearl Islands game and especially her Heroes versus Villains games, as I don't really feel like she had that much control in either of those games. I mean, obviously in Pearl Islands, she was the majority for a lot of it, but obviously she gets flipped on at the final 8 with the Rupert blindside. And while she does get credit for the Burton move at the final 5, I mean, she didn't really have too much control at the end of the game and really gets lucky by Lil being willing to take her to the end over Johnny Fairplay, especially considering that she didn't really treat Lil super well in that season. But she does, and she wins the season largely because Lil had already been voted out of the game and didn't really have any respect from the jury, so there's that to consider. And then obviously on Heroes vs. Villains, largely a similar story in that she doesn't really have too much control across the game. Now, she does get a lot of credit for the coach move by convincing Russell that coach was starting to flip on him after voting out Boston Rob. But even then, I mean, she doesn't really gain that much control by voting out coach, even though it's still somewhat impressive that she was able to play with Russell's ego in order to do so. And again, she doesn't really have too much control. She tries to vote out Russell over and over again, even though if she did that would significantly lower her chances of getting to the end and winning. And by the end game, like she's lucky enough to get to the end against the person she was trying to vote out and wins largely because, again, she was against Russell and much of the jury was against Russell too. So I feel like she gets pretty lucky there. And I know people kind of have been lowering their opinion of her, especially with Game Changers, Winners at War, and Australian Survivor. But even then, I feel like people tend to excuse those by saying that, oh, well, since she's a two-time winner now, that she'll never get a proper shake again, now that people know her game, and are more likely to target her moving forward. And there isn't really too much she can do as a result. And I do agree with that. I mean, I don't really feel she has much of a chance coming into any season anymore, considering her reputation. But I feel like at the end of the day, if we look at her two winning games, I mean, they aren't too impressive. And yet people like are propping her up as one of the greatest players of all time. And I kind of get that. However, I feel like if we look at the way in which she won her two games, I mean, she doesn't really demonstrate herself as this all-time great player. Now, again, it's so impressive that she was able to win two times, and I think since when Heroes versus Villains, she has done some impressive stuff, particularly in Game Changers, and even on Australian Survivor, where yes, she didn't really have much of a chance in those seasons. I still feel like she gets kind of screwed over on both those seasons with her getting swap screwed, and I do think she demonstrated some gameplay through that. But again, similar to Parvati, people talk about her as this flawless player who was able to masterfully like fly under the radar, implement this anyone but me strategy, get to the end twice and win two times. And yes, while it's good that she was able to do that, I mean, I don't really think that's enough to demonstrate her as the greatest player of all time, the way that people do hail her as. And I did debate over whether Rich should be more overrated than her, as people still tend to talk about Rich as his all-time great player, really the person that invented the game of Survivor. However, I think people have largely fallen off the Rich train, mainly because he hasn't played in a long time, and people have acknowledged the fact that the game has evolved beyond what Rich was able to quote-unquote implement on his season. Whereas I feel like with Sandra, Sandra is someone that people still talk about, someone that has played more recently. And I think is someone that people still prop up as one of the greatest players of all time, when I simply don't think that's the case. So I feel like for all those reasons, I feel like Sandra is the most overrated Survivor winner in my eyes. And while not the worst winner, I feel like it's enough to put her here on number one for this list. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And I do want to make a follow-up to this video by talking about the most underrated winners, so stay tuned for that video. And I do have some other fun Survivor videos planned during this off season, so stay tuned for that. I also hope to make some brand steals soon, so stay tuned for that as well. But for now, that is the video. See ya.